walk in front of it. Okay. Are you on, Mark? Are you sorted? Yeah.
Okay. Thanks ever so much for inviting me up, Clem. Real privilege to come up to this part of the world. I love it up here, and just great seeing a different part of the world and seeing how this works. And I know there's loads of people here who are already doing a lot, and so I'm not here to tell people what to do or to be any kind of expert. I'm just going to say what I do, and hopefully that's useful to people. I'll also, a little bit of background on the farm is, I grew up on a 180-acre farm. We're still there on the farmstead, but due to family illness and other bits and pieces, we ended up on having 44 acres of pasture plus the farm buildings left, and spent a long time trying to find organic or ecological or ways of farming that didn't lose you too much money, and found out lots of ways not to make money. But since looking at holistic management and holistic plan grazing, we now rent another 400 acres, and we're up to I just need to touch something, and we're up to 90 Pedigree Angus cows running on that, and then plus the followers and everything else. So and that's really, that system has allowed me to do that because it's given us cash flow and it's allowed us to build the business. It also says I work for Natural England as a lead advisor. I work full time. One of the questions I saw on the farm questionnaires that you guys filled out was about time and labour, and I think that's a key thing. There shouldn't be an awful lot, and for me, I don't want to get, Pedigree Angus are expensive. And I don't want to get in too much debt when I'm starting out in a business, when I'm starting from scratch. I don't have a legacy herd or a legacy farm. I'm building the business, and that's where it is. Just a couple of slides at the beginning. I'm not going to do the whole sort of history of holistic management because I can see that most people know where they are with the holistic plan grazing. But just to point out that one of the key reason behind it really is that if we focus on metrics, there's been loads of talk about metrics today already. And if we focus on some of this stuff incorrectly in a reductionist way, we can go down some really stupid roads, and we can do things that are not good for us, not good for the environment, not good for communities. These things, although, in the States, people I talk to over there, some of them are big supporters of the feedlots and all that sort of stuff, and they say it supports communities, but then their towns are dying. So, small farms over here, similar problems. And that's a result of our reductionist thinking, and that's why we need to think more holistically. This is another example here, another feedlot with the lovely mountains in the background, except that is a pile of manure. That's not a mountain. And so I think we can accept, I think anybody can accept that even if you if you're a believer in intensive agriculture, that there are some things that we do that perhaps we shouldn't do, and I think that would probably be an example. That's actually smoke. That was on fire for 2 years. They couldn't put it out. And these systems are what they come up with all the CO2 methane emissions for cattle, and then blame our extensive systems for climate change when, this couldn't be more different, could it? That was when we had on the one rented farm. Those were a bunch of 45 fattening cattle we had on there. Finished off grass. You can see we're sort of diverse meadowland, native pastures. There'd probably be 15 species of grass. There's another 15 herbs in there as well. And we're grazing that right through the flowering period, which a lot of conservationists would say we shouldn't do. But because there'll be a 60-day rest period, that only gets 2 days of grazing. Then all the wildflowers come back and seed, and we're increasing in diversity all the time on that farm. You can see these are cattle coming down for a move. You can see how quickly we're moving on. We're leaving an awful lot behind through that spring-summer period, especially when we're building stockpile, and we can talk a bit about that later. But I think it just shows the potential. We averaged on a 12 months outwintered, no hay, grazing only stockpile in the winter, 0.8 kilos gain a day, and that includes the winter. So, we're making probably double that in the summer and maybe half that in the winter, I'm guessing. I didn't I didn't weigh them throughout the year. But that's just to point out that grasslands are really important as a habitat in their own right. And I think at a time when lots of people are talking about rewilding, which frightens me to death, when lots of people are talking about how bad farming is and can be, I think the idea that we can have productive and ecological grasslands really important, positive messages for our industry. And we're just talking at the start with a couple of you about, I grew up in a house where when we talked around the kitchen table, it was bad news on the prices we were getting. It was bad news on the input costs. There was animal health issues because our stocking rates were so high. There wasn't a lot of positive talk around. And then we look at what we're doing with holistic management and with my kids involved now, and it's all positive. We can see the benefits, the gains, the animal health benefits. Everything seems to be moving in the right direction, and that's a very different, at a time when our rural communities are hollowing out a bit, it's important to have that positive message. I'll get on the soapbox now. And then, I love that quote there. But the other thing we're perhaps talking a little bit about today is what's the potential of the systems. And I always love that idea. We know from the fossil record that even with the feedlots, even with the growing of the maize, with everything else, and feeding cattle, mainly, most of the cropland is in America is used to feed cattle, and we still haven't beaten the stocking rate and the stocking levels and the productivity of the plains today. So the natural systems are still out competing, except we're destroying them and doing worse. I think the potential here is huge, but we don't really know where that is. And I think you all know about the ideas of mobbed cattle. Is anyone not? Because I think who's mob grazing? Put your hands up. Paddock. Okay. Who knows about holistic management, mob grazing, and they've done lots of research and spent far too long on YouTube and all that sort of stuff? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. So I can skip through a lot of this. But just to say that, previous systems of agriculture, before we put fences everywhere, from the hills down to the lowlands, cattle moved and they were driven, and in this country, in Europe, everywhere. And there's a quote about climate change, and we hear a lot about that, don't we? You've got one of those. There's a couple of copies, the one that came round, and there's also the leaflet as well. This is actually, Clem asked me to do 10 minutes on holistic management, and I think that's really important as well. There's a lot of talk about metrics. There's a lot of talk about how do we measure what we're doing against other things already, and that's great. But I also think we need to be careful we don't just start, looking at our dry matter production in isolation, or we don't start looking at cattle growth rates in isolation. We need to be balancing a lot of this. Reading through one of the farm surveys or reports you guys filled in was a really good little paragraph from somebody, I can't remember who it was, just talking about how we aim for optimum. We don't aim to maximise anything. It's all about the optimum. I couldn't agree more with that, because your profitability gets affected by so many different things. You can't quite see that, nor can I actually read it, but you've got that written down there. So I will go through, and I think one of the key things here is that holistic management, holistic grazing, which we're all doing, probably very few of you are actually doing mob grazing. Well, everyone calls it mob grazing. Mob grazing, you'd have to be moving your cattle probably in our environment and our dry matter levels per hectare 5+ times a day. Is anyone doing that? So nobody's mob grazing. So we're doing holistic plan grazing. We're planning our grazing according to our holistic goals. And that means not just looking, when I talk about holistic, it's not some hippie idea. It's about not being reductionist. It's not looking at one thing, it's looking at the whole. And so that's why it's really important to have a statement of purpose, like what are we for? We can't just say, well, I'm a farmer and we want to be a farmer. That's not enough detail. We don't know, if you don't have a statement of purpose of what you're there for, if you don't have an understanding of who the decision makers are, what your resource base is, what your land, your stock, the available money, if that's not all, and know exactly where you want to go and have a target for that, then your business doesn't have a straight line view of where it needs to go. And if you do increase your dry matter, there's every chance, if you don't have those goals in view, that you might increase your income, but your costs might increase with them. So what are you actually achieving? You're probably just adding risk into your business. Part of that as well is also quality of life, looking at how you're producing in terms of forms of production and thinking about your future resource base. Do you want to own more land? Do you want to have more cattle? How's that going to be, what's the succession plan with the family? How's that going to fit in? All of these things are really important to decide early on, because if you don't plan for them now, then decisions you're making in your business about dry matter, about your breed of cow, size of frame on your cattle, all of those things, they figure into all of this. And I tend to find that in the green line down here, which is your ecosystem processes, that's what we all like to talk about. And we like to talk about the tools of management. We like to talk about how we graze. And everywhere I go, everyone likes to talk about how we graze and the wildlife and the ecosystems, because that's the most interesting bit. But it's actually the other bits. It's how we fit into our local community, how our business has a social output as well as a ecological as well as a financial output. And it's about how that fits with our family as well. I do work a lot of hours. My family don't see a huge amount of me sometimes, so that has to be managed, because if I have a really successful business, my family falls apart and my kids aren't happy, then that's not a successful business. And so all of these things factor in. And again, it's often not what people want to talk about, but I really do recommend that you have a look at the Alan Savory book, the Holistic Management book itself. I'll try and just show you that. Is everyone aware of that? They've seen that? So it's well worth reading it, rereading it, and every time I revisit it, I improve my financial planning, I improve on focusing on making sure that family side, the social side is taken care of as well. It's all right, we'll talk about grazing in a minute. But we've also got to think about how we make decisions, and we've got to test those against that holistic goal. And a good example of that would be there's a weak link test that you might look. So most farmers actually are really comfortable about the resource conversion part of their business. So if that's one link of the chain, which is turning sunlight and rainfall into grass, into beef, let's say, in our situation, or into milk or whatever. So that side is usually covered off pretty well once you get the holistic grazing side of things sorted. Then you're going to have another one of those links would be the product conversion. So it's turning that beef into a product. Are you actually just saying, I'm going to accept wholesale? Or, are you a price taker? Or have you actually created a product that people want to buy? Or are you just going to accept the market is the market and I'll supply the market? And that's your product conversion. And then the product conversion is then linked to your marketing or your money conversion link. And then you can look at, and these are the two where most of the people I work with on holistic management, that they fall down or they don't put focus, that would be their weak links. And it would be these that are actually preventing the business from taking that extra step. And I think it's really important to look at places we perhaps don't usually look to try and maximise the best use of our time in terms of how can we have a bigger financial impact on our business that needs to be sustainable, but also that's financial as well. And that market monetary conversion at the end, the other link of that chain, is a really important one to focus on as well. I think also in terms of points of view, it's a really good part of the process as well. The decision-making framework is also about, rather than just accepting that's what cattle are worth, and then we just end up in a mindset of trying to cut our costs, so that we've got a margin. And that's kind of where a lot of people I work with, that's where they're at, that's the price I receive, I've got this many cattle, I can maybe have more cattle, and if we can reduce costs, that's the margin. But something you're encouraged to do is to perhaps look at your turnover within holistic management and say 50% of that turnover should be profit. And I mean net profit after tax. So that's a plannable expenditure. And you should be planning your profit as your first cost. That's the first thing that you pay. You pay yourself first. and then you force yourself to make decisions on your cost making. One of the things that we did as soon as after the first course was to go through and have a war on cost. And we did have that, and just how much stuff you're spending that just doesn't need to be spent, and being absolutely ruthless. How many tractors do you need? Are there many cattle operations that need more than one tractor? Honestly, because you cannot mow, bale, or turn hay, or wrap silage for the same price that a contractor can do it. If you factor in your depreciation, your building costs. Do they need to be there? Could they be rented out? Could you do something else with it? So you have to be ruthless on all these things. Are these costs, these capital costs, actually part of your fixed costs, or are they potentially variable and things you could do something different with? So I add that in. That's 10 minutes, very quick, on how we can look at holistic management rather than just a holistic grazing. And I recommend you really have a look at that process. And it's, this is a 6-9 day course, that you can go into detail on this stuff. So it's just worth something to revisit in the future. And then hopefully you get results like that. We've all seen the fence line photos that we all love. In terms of the actual grazing side of things, that rule there from Andre Vauxan's grass productivity is the most important out of anything that we look at in terms of managing our grass, in my experience, and it's about the regrowth. So it's that back fence. There's some people will do strip grazing, or they'll just have a front face fence and they don't run a back fence. And I think it's just, for those who aren't convinced when you're talking to other farmers, I always just do it as a maths problem, which is basically, if that is a field, that whole area, and you split it and you're going to have 30 days grazing, and then you move the cattle out, then it starts regrowing on day 31. Even if we didn't get a productivity boost from moving them at the right time as well, just the fact that if you put that into 30 days strips, then that first strip starts regrowing day 2. And so by the time you've gone out the field, you've got 28 days regrowth. And it's really that simple. It's the same principle for the 3-leaf system. It's absolutely, the back fence is everything. And I think when we're looking at how we can maximise or improve our grazing systems, Alan Savory has said Andre Vauxan's work in this particular book cannot be bettered in our environment. And I think that's worth considering. And I think sometimes we try and get like how much density can we get, how much trampling can we get, but actually this is probably, you don't need to do too much more than that. And we obviously use our fence to do that. And the key thing about this is what happens to the regrade plant. So ignore the writing, but this is just a good example that actually, this idea of root kill, I think, is largely a myth from digging lots of holes around the farm and seeing what's going on. That you can graze it off to a reasonable level as long as you don't take it too low without really any damage to the roots at all, because it's not a good thing for that plant to do, to kill off its root systems that's feeding the plant. It only has to do that if it gets regrazed after growing again, because it's not got enough energy put back into the roots and the crown of the plant to regrow. And that's the simplest way of looking at it for me, and that's why the deep-rooted species like cocksfoot is basically the heart of my system. That and tall fescue. And the deep-rooted herbs as well. And that's because it's got that huge energy store, really deep-rooted. They'll go down 2 metres if you've got the right soil type. And that's bringing up, it's a huge root system, and it's bringing up all those nutrients that's starting that flywheel of momentum. And I find each year you get sort of a bigger, heavier turn on that wheel, and you build the momentum into your system. And that's what we're trying to do is rather than have, say, temporary lays that actually reduce in their productivity each year so they have to be renewed, is to have diversity in lays that increase in productivity every year. That might mean that we have to reduce our stocking rate to start with while we build our soil resilience to make sure we're not damaging that soil as we're building the organic matter, we're building the energy and the life forms in it that actually drive that productive system. And I think that that's what we're all looking at. And you can you know, if that regrows and you allow it to get to its full height, or you allow it to at least have put the energy back into the roots and crown for it to regrow, then it's all good. Also, this would be another thing I would say about. I'll try and cover some of the points that you asked in the questions, and one of them was about the comparison with the three-leaf system. One of the things we do know, there's a lot said about rooting depth and plant roots that I think there's a lot we don't know about roots and their reaction to grazing. But one thing that's been shown in many studies is the fact that in the same species, the size of the mature plant is more or less equal to the amount of root mass below ground. And so if you're going to go for a three-leaf system, let's say you've got a smaller amount of biomass above ground, never getting above that, your rooting depth and your root density is going to be a lot less. And if you look at the difference between those two plants, and you imagine winter grazing on this field compared to winter grazing on that field, and it's our winter time and our autumn time, wet shoulders of the year, those are our expensive times. That's what costs us money. Every week, I saw a great thing on Twitter yesterday. There was I think I've got to put it in the slide, which was every day that you're not feeding silage is a day you're not feeding silage. It's, you know, quite simple, but it's absolutely spot on. Continuous grazing, not the same problem as if you've got the three-leaf system. There's just enough rest, hopefully, in there. But there is an element here with rooting depth. And, you know, if these are different species, and this is an unpalatable species, let's say that's creeping thistle, let's say that's a dock, whatever weed problem you've got, this is not getting grazed in a continuous graze system because they're going back to their favourite plants over here, stressing them out. And because they're their favourite, they're probably the ones with the high nutrition, the ones you want. But you're selecting them, these are really unhealthy. Maybe they won't even have viable seed because they're not very healthy. But also, your weed species, which is going undergrazed, has got wonderful root system. It's having a party in the soil. It's going to have loads of viable offspring, which are then going to find it really easy to outcompete these plants over here. So we're potentially creating our own problems from our continuous grazing system. Some people talk about root soil biology and soil chemistry differences with the microbiome in terms of the fungal bacterial balance in the soil and having greater rooting depth and having that pulse of grazing, then a rest, can help with putting more starches and sugars into the soil and actually change your biology, change your soil chemistry. And maybe that's right, I don't know. But I think one of the key factors as well is root competition. There's no root competition down there for that weed species. For that could be a species of grass you don't like, whatever. It could be rushes. 10 minutes, so we'll go quick. Planning grazing. So we're looking around, making sure perhaps we're not going to be grazing the conservation programme area when that bird is nesting, when that plant's in flower. So we plan our grazing from that perspective. We plan it from where our water is, and we'll split the farm up. Infrastructure is important, but actually people asked about that a little bit, but I would keep it as simple as you can and as flexible as you can. Don't put anything too permanent in. You can do everything with electric fencing, and it doesn't really matter what sort of electric fencing, just buy whatever your local agricultural supplies has got. The drag troughs are great from Kiwi Tech. That's one thing I would say, they're fabulous. But also if you've got buildings up here or handling pens, then maybe it's a good idea to plan your grazing rotation so you're going to be in the right place for calving or weaning or whatever, so that you haven't got to bring cattle a long way at stressful times of the year. And you should be planning that into your grazing plan. That's on Tim May's farm in Hampshire. He's made his own drag trough with a metal plate on the bottom, which he just drags with the quad. Quick connectors. I don't actually use quick connectors. And I'm going to rush through some of this. That's some of our winter stockpile. We've probably got about 1,500 to 2,000 kilos per hectare of available. So there's probably 3,000 plus 3,500 standing. We leave about 1,500 residual through the winter. We try and basically utilise as much as we can in the winter. Open up the sward. And having that daily bite, more or less equal nutrition, is important. Otherwise, you can end up with a problem where every day the nutritional take's getting worse if you don't actually strip graze that out, if they were on the same patch all the time over winter. And there's a question about, is the forage good enough? So I'll cover some of your questions. That was going to be the last 10 minutes through here anyway. And this is, I think it's really interesting, because if you took a forage analysis of that, and people were talking about that, it probably wouldn't come out very good. But if you looked at what they're eating, because we're leaving so much behind, they're actually taking the best. And there's studies been done in the States where they've just copied what the cattle are eating, and it's come out as good as any ryegrass clover lay in terms of protein levels. Also, a lot of the wildflowers, people forget that 18, 19, 20, 22, 23% protein. So if you've got a low protein fill belly grass with it, that's actually a perfect diet, perfect rumen function. So in the spring we don't have a lot of problems. We have perfect cow pats throughout the year. They've even done studies where they've cut a hole in the side of the cow, sent them out to graze and done that difference, and they can pull the forage out, test it, and that shows that the cattle are even better than the people at copying the cattle. But they select the best. They know what they're after. I won't do too much on the gross margins, but you can quiz me on that because we've got shorter time. So that's kind of what we're looking at. Meadow Foxtail, that's a staple grass for me, probably the most important grass in my system, because it's heading by April, so I've got a really nice balance of carbon and nitrogen in that mouthful. And then the other side of the holistic management is looking to maximise income, and so we started a few years ago Pedigree Angus herd. Those are some of the first heifers that arrived, and then that was them calved out this summer. Wintered out entirely. They have some rough hay and stockpile, and that's it. And these are 700 to 800 kilo cows. And we're using native Angus bulls on them. Those are two half brothers that we've got running with them. So we're quite close breeding, but we're doing that to bring frame size down, but also have the advantage of the growth rates of the modern Angus. But the huge, great big cattle, these 1,000 kilo cows, Angus cows, we're not interested in that. We just want a moderate cow that's not going to get penalised on the rail. Maternal is where your profit is. I'm not going to go into the EBV stuff too much, but I just show in terms of here. So I'm always looking, be careful not to just select on calving ease, but also select on the daughters. Otherwise you can end up with some narrow cattle that have calving problems. Growth rates, I'm not worried about at all because they grade if you buy the right bull, and as long as the lightest heifers are 275 kilos dead weight, then we're happy. And I like to have the fat depth higher, obviously want the fertility traits as high as we can, and intramuscular fat. That's that bull. If you think that's not going to grade, then I would use him more, but he's a carrier for developmental duplication. So that's a small cow in Canada, but that's really just to show more of the type. So the depth of thigh, moderate length. You don't want to go to, this brick on four legs. Too much length can be a negative, but you've got the engine of the animal there, and you want plenty of that. It's about that optimum volume, maximising volume per size of cow, basically. And just to show that the smaller cows, I'd probably go smaller if we didn't get penalised on small cattle in the abattoir. But I don't want to sell a bull that it's not going to work for someone on the rail, the heifers if they're selling those fat. So that's the limit I put on that. But it's optimal everything, and again it's about looking at all the different aspects and making sure that these are the things that cost you money, and so those are more important than a fabulous growth rate that leads to poor feet, poor legs, and infertility. Very high correlation of infertility with high growth rates. That's something that the feed merchants don't tell you. And also this is a really good study that was done in Wales. And again, it's really important to look at the whole when we're looking we were talking about metrics for grass productivity, or if we look at metrics for growth rates in cattle, But if you look at the impact of using a terminal sire, really low impact. That's one of the lowest impacts of anything. Cow longevity, which is all about the maternal aspect. Size of cow is going to have a big impact on your longevity. Size of cow is going to have a big impact on your feed costs, your calving period, calf survival, all of those maternal traits. And so that's where our profit is made and lost. And there's nothing wrong with those high growth cattle. This is not me complaining about those Aberdeen Angus breeders who've got fantastic high growth cattle, but I'd look at them like a seedless grape. So use them, but don't keep the heifers. You know, then you'd have a maternal bull with the rest of your herd. But again, weaning rates have a huge impact on your profitability. Just have a look at some of the diversity. So that's a field we had. We seeded that down as an arable field. We seeded it down in August. We had 2 tonne per acre off there in hay, and that's the regrowth this autumn in a drought year. And that's what the diversity does. And also you've got the great pollen and nectar source there as well. But there's productivity, ecological balance, and also real good mineral profile from all those different plants that keep the cattle healthy. Some of our bale grazing through the winter, that's the extensive bale grazing.
Sorry, can't see it.
I'll step back. So what we'll tend to do is we'll graze up to a bale or 2 bales, depending on how we set them out and how many cows in a mob. And then, we'll roll those over. So one of those bales will do about 20 cows, 25 heifers for a day. So we make them eat the grass in the winter, then we roll the bale, otherwise they waste both. And every bale is another day's grazing for that number of cattle.
Sorry, but when you say roll it over, do you mean stand it on end and let them have it, or you roll it out?
I roll it out because we're buying hay from species-rich meadows, so we want to spread that seed into our. So we're buying hay from triple SIs, so we roll it out. But you can just turn it up. But you can, if you want to roll it, but you can just. The great thing is just roll it straight over the electric fence, and it's done. It's a bit of a struggle in the snow, but.
So I presume the cattle, you graze them a day on a strip, and then they introduce the bale back to that strip.
Yeah. Yeah, and then and when I'm winter grazing, I'm not as worried about the back fence. Back fence would probably come in day 8.
More space to do less damage, or?
Yes, basically.
Could we state questions for the recording?
Okay, yes. So do I give them that extra space so that I'm doing less damage? And the answer was yes. So this is in Canada. This is a Pedigree Angus herd that's running a similar system over there. And they put those bales out about 3 cow lengths apart. So 2 cows can be at different bales. There's enough room between them to move. Intensive bale grazing, which we're doing this year, we've got 200 round bales out in one of the fields set out like that, and that's going to be our March-April grazing. And you know, it's a good thing to have in the snow, but then that starts to bring us to the questions. You know, if you're on free draining ground, particularly, is, you know, do you need to house cattle? I find that the outwintered cattle are so much healthier than anything is shed. There's never a respiratory problem, and as long as they're full, they're happy. And you know, our winters, you know, we don't really have a problem with our winters. It's, what is it? I think it's cows are using energy to cool down until it gets to -20. So in terms of the, you know, maybe if it's 2 degrees and sideways rain, then that's equivalent of -20. But essentially, if they're full, their rumen, and particularly if they're full of dry matter and dry grass or hay, their rumen's operating at a high temperature, about 40 degrees C, and that's what's keeping them warm. So wintering costs are low. That was the quote I saw on Twitter yesterday, which was great. And I think this is important as well. Like, where's the next generation coming in? You know, a lot of the systems we look at the moment are very high capital input if people want to get started in farming. But to be honest, you can get started with some electric fence gear and some contract cows or heifers. So hopefully we've covered a little bit about Threeleaf versus holistic. I would say wintering cattle out is better, and that gives you more time, saves you on the wintering costs. So whilst you might get more production from the Threeleaf system, you're probably going to get better cost reduction. And it's also about which direction you're going with the 3-leaf system. You're probably reducing fertility long term. And there's something that Andre Vozan talks about, which is the undue acceleration. So where your rotation speeds up through the year because you're not allowing those plant energy to get back into the plant roots. Species diversity is fantastic for drought tolerance, but cocksfoot, tall fescue, red clovers, birdsfoot trefoil, all the deep-rooted herbs. Someone was saying about a pedigree herd. I'll just make sure you get everything set up with your grazing system first. Is it part of your holistic goal? Is it something you'd like to do? Are you adding something to your business that you can't give 100% to? So I would say either jump in or don't. And you're going to go for terminal or maternal. You know, you've got to decide how that works out for you. Talking to Charlie about his forage rye, really interested in that. Something that we'd like to try actually is weaning our calves in March onto a overwintered forage rye or potentially a forage brassica. But to give some real quality into March. Once we're into April, because we've got the Meadow Foxtail, which is just away by then, we've always got grass for them, high quality grass at that time of year. And so hopefully they're not being weaned and stressed at that time. Fixed costs, the amount of, folks have helped in the past and they've got all these fixed costs and you go and they can't do anything about them and you go and have a look around and there's 4 tractors on the farm. And it's not so much the fact that they could sell them, but how much each of those, when you look through the accounts, is costing them every year in terms of maintenance. Plus the diesel bills, what's diesel gone up to at the moment and where is that going to go in the future? If we can do without it, then I think it's good for the system. Labour costs, again, and comes into time, should be pretty low. If I can manage 90 cows working full time as well, it's pretty busy during calving, but then you keep your calving period down to 45, 60 days. You're also selecting for your fertile cows as well, selecting for fertility. And I think someone was wondering about Brexit, and I'd say just think about, there's that, forget the guy's name, is it Richard Covey? But you've got your circle of influence and your circle of concern. And the way the media works nowadays is we're concerned about absolutely everything. Everyone's 100% offended by everything that everybody says. So I think it's just, if we just say that let's think about what we can influence, and that's about our own little world that we manage, focus on that, never mind about Brexit. But look, you want to plan for the future. Subsidies were going to go anyway, regardless of Brexit, within the next 15, 20 years. As a tenant farmer, I don't get a lot of those subsidies anyway. But if we look at what's happened in New Zealand, what have they done in terms of sheep and cattle? They've gone for smaller frame, more maternal, and they've all, it's all about, your lambing calving percentage, doing whatever you can off grass, and that's the way we're going to go. We're in a perfect climate for grass growing. Everywhere you go, we complain about the weather. Everyone's got the worst soil type. We've got the best land, the best climate in the world for livestock farming. And we should be making the most of that for the ecology, for our own finance, and for our families and communities. That's it. Did I go over?
A little bit, but because you answered quite a few questions there, we've got about 10 minutes just now for questions, but bearing in mind we'll be going out and about as well and have other time to discuss and talk more. I'm going to put soup on to heat up while you answer questions.
Sounds good.
Simple question, Rob. What growth stage are you aiming to actually put your stock into the grass, or are you just not really fussed about that?
It's always difficult early in the season, and if you've got 6 inches of grass in the middle of the March and it's not too wet, then that temptation's always there, isn't it? And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. If you think you're going to get a good growing year and things are looking good, then there's no reason why you can't go in early, but then you might give that a double rest. So, or you just rest it until that boot stage. So it's as soon as that's starting to put a seed head up, as you get past June, July time, the species are far less likely to send a shoot up. So you're just going on that vegetative state. So as soon as it's got to that peak vegetative state, you can go in and graze it because it's pretty much put the stores back in.
If it gets past it, you just go for it anyway.
Yeah, we go through it anyway and graze it, and it always gets ahead of us. So we're not too concerned about that. The forage, the value of the forage, or the quality of the forage, we just don't seem to have a problem. Something with the cock's foot that's interesting later in the year when things have gone a bit more died off, senescent, is if you look at the base of a cock's foot plant, because you're grazing differently, you're not grazing off to the floor, you have a much bigger tussock, and each of those grass stems at the bottom will have a little bulb which is full of starch, and they'll hunt that out, and that starch is what makes animals fat. You know, it's the carbs that make the animals fat, and they search that out, and I think that's something that's sort of missing from a lot of our diet, the cattle diets, when we're looking at a ryegrass mix, where we're relying on sugars rather than starches, which has a potentially negative impact in other areas on the animal. So I look at the body condition and how the cattle are doing whilst they're growing or performing or raising a calf. That's how you measure the forage quality. But try and keep it vegetative. The mob grazers in America would tell me I was wrong on that, but I try and the other thing is I'd say is I try from July. This is what I used to do, is that from July I would, you come into May and you're skim grazing because you're trying to get across the farm as quick as possible to try and stop everything going to seed, and then it gets ahead of you anyway. And then you get into sort of July time, and then I'm starting to think about winter stockpile. So I don't want to be grazing it off to the ground because that's going to impact the amount of regrowth I'm going to get. So then I started skim grazing through the summer. So I end up with a real high quality forage because they're not grazing everything. They're actually just going and picking the best and moving all the time. And that has had a really beneficial impact. And as soon as they get onto these high sugar autumn grasses, the condition just goes on the cattle like you wouldn't believe at this time of year. And then you've got high residuals, which you're then going through. And because you've also got that longer grass left behind, you've got much better root development as well. So when you get to the winter, you can winter out for a lot longer.
Did you start with your species-rich grass? Did you inherit that, or did you build that from scratch?
Not at home, and we didn't have time today to go into it, but I can have a chat to you about how we've added that in. But green hay strewing, the bale rolling itself as well.
Because, I mean, I started from scratch, and the worst thing I did was speak to a seed merchant.
Yeah, don't do that. Yeah, no, I mean, you
mentioned Coxford to these guys, they think you're crazy.
Well, if you look at one of the most popular people for selling mob grazing mixes at the moment, and if you actually look at the mix, it's heavy on ryegrass, and the deep-rooted species they've put is a Festulolium, which is an infertile hybrid. So they're selling you seeds that don't, renew themselves. Because our system goes to seed every year, that's something else I didn't talk about. But if you have if you screw up and you end up having a pugged patch, you poach it up. Well, the seed rate from that grass all setting seed is probably double what you would put on if you broadcast on. And so the weed seedlings that might come in there, there's a lot of germination competition straight away. Whereas in a conventional system, there's all, whether it's Threeleaf or whether it's set stocked, there's no seed set, so there's no germination competition at all for those weeds. So all that sort of fits in. But you want to have fertile grasses and herbs, yeah.
I'm sure there's something on the PFLA about clovers being sterile and the impact on bees. I'm sure I read that somewhere. And I thought, I just asked somebody about it when we had a PFLA study to it.
So, yeah, I think I saw something. I don't know the detail on that, but something I do know on the bird's foot trefoil I've noticed is the wild bird's foot trefoil seeds. They go into a spiral. It's a pea family. They spiral crack and the seed drops. If you buy the bird's foot trefoil that's in most seed mixes, those seed pods do not crack. And if you're really cynical, you'd think that's on purpose. So you have to buy some more bird's foot trefoil. But the good thing is, because you've let it go to seed in this system, if cattle graze, those small legume seams pass through cattle really easily, and so we get loads of bird's foot trefoil, loads of clover popping up in the cow pats, and that's a really good way to reseed if you graze through at the right time. And you can take cattle from, if you can see, there's loads of, we got some really good mixtures of red clover and birdfoot trefoil on some patches. So, and there's some areas nearby that don't have that. And so we can graze that one day, and then the next move will be onto the area that doesn't have it as good, and they'll be dropping that seed. And that's a really good way of doing it.
So we're going to,
Starting from scratch, say if I've got 20-year-old, just a 20-year-old sort of permanent pasture that's not had anything on it. How long does it take to get, if you let it grow, how long does it take for those roots to go down and the grasses to grow up? Because they're not used to it for years.
No.
They've not been used to it. So does it take? Is it a year or is it 2 years or it depends on?
Yeah, I think.
Because it must be hard.
12, yeah, first year,
Must be hard.
first winter. So if I think about the farms I've taken on, these are farms. Well, the first farm in particular had really good species because there's a lot of cocksfoot there, but it had been grazed off to a billiard table. So that I took that on in the May. The sheep had come off in the April. There was nothing there. I didn't put any stock on until middle of July, so that everything had gone up. And then then we strip grazed through it, and then we wintered on it. But it was touch and go that winter. I probably did more damage than good that winter. It was one of the wettest winters on record, and it was one heavy clay. So, but we got through. But yeah, I think it does take another. If I'd taken them inside that winter earlier, I think it would have been a better job. So I think I'd say 2 or 3 years of keeping on housing, with the understanding that you're increasing that root mass, and it's not just the root mass. Like when I dig into the soil, you'll see all the fungal hyphae. It's like almost looks a bit mouldy, but it's all these bright white. Those things just keep the air in the soil. It keeps it draining, and that really seems to keep the cattle up. And the yarrow, I notice wherever I've got yarrow, I've got more fungal stuff in the soil, and that's always the driest areas. So yarrow's a great one.
when you first took over the farms, after you sort of moved on from the legacy where you were home from, how much focus did you put, or how much emphasis did you put with regards to your management on the fertility itself when you got there? Because I mean, you speak to a lot of people, they say, look, because I've got a land management legacy that I'm battling all the time from years and years and years and years of ploughing.
Yeah.
And I'm constantly observing growth characteristics that just blow my mind. But then, you know, you speak to an agronomist and all these guys and they say, pile on the lime, but to pile on lime on our acreage is a pretty major effort, but I need a degree of productivity from that.
Have you got your acid soil then?
Yeah, on
6.
the whole, it's about sort of average would be about 5-7.
Okay, so to be honest, I don't think lime is a negative. A lot of triple SI grasslands will have lime on. What you'll find is if you don't have the organic matter levels, once you get to about 10% organic matter, you won't need the lime because organic matter has a neutralising impact itself, and so you don't need that then. And that's the natural state for a lot of our soils. So although we have less acid soils now, if they were healthy and above 10% organic matter, they would be more neutral and you'd get more species. So the lime can actually help you in terms of increasing the diversity that you'll get, and that diversity will help you build the organic matter. So if you have got a problem, it could be something that could help, but you want to put it through that testing decisions, like what is the cost, what is it, cost-benefit analysis, what's it going to give you, and are you willing to wait 5-7 years to get to the same result without spending that money?
This is a great guy I spoke to, said you didn't see the Native Americans going around bags of lime to produce the most fertile soils in the world.
No, and they're on more acidic soil there as well, so yeah.
So again,
They're on more acidic soil over there as well.
yeah, well, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's quite inspiring
Yeah.
to me particularly.
But also, we've also got to accept that some of our organic matter levels, you know, natural levels would probably be 15% plus in a semi-natural or a natural environment, and our soils are nowhere near that. So it's not actually natural for your soil to be at 4% organic matter, and so that's the problem. Those Native American soils were built up through evolution, through hundreds and hundreds of years following the glacial melt. So it's not, you know what I mean. So if you've got that time, then maybe. But
There's an American that I forgot his name. I very remember Joel Sallant did a fair bit. But I'm sure there's a guy who forced fed his soils using cattle and mob grazing and generated vast volumes of organic matter in a relatively short period of time.
Yeah, it can be done, and you can do that with cover crops, potentially grazing high impact, deep rooting cover crops. Gabe Brown's done a lot of that.
Dave Brown, that was the guy.
Yeah, so it's possible. I'm not sure. I'm just not sure about that, but we'll see. Well, it may be. Have a go.
You're buying in hay. Is that because you don't want to cut your own hay and mess up your grazing, or is that because you're buying in the seed?
It's because I'm buying in the seed primarily, but at the same time I don't want to. Haying takes so much out of the ground, and so what we looked at initially was if I took the cost of my straw that I bought in, which there's no small matter these days, is it? And then I looked at the cost of my contracting on my own forage, and if I could replace that cost with buying in hay, then I'm buying someone else's fertility, and that's the best fertiliser I can buy. And that might actually be, I've got one of the field where I'm doing the intensive bale grazing. I'm really excited to see. I mean, we made a bit of a mess of that field last year, and I did Roger Savoury, Alan's son, I did a Skype consult with him, and he's like, intensive bale graze it. Just put as many bales as you can and graze it, and the organic matter within 2 or 3 years, it'll be you'll be amazed. And that could be a way round it. So you're feeding your cattle instead of buying lime. That might be, But then
2 more questions. We've got Tony.
As an additional to a family farm, we bought 100 acres next door. The management of that was given to me. So I thought, right, I'll join the soil association things and I'll come to other places and I'll see how to grow grass. The 100 acres that we bought had, by the previous guy, just been nitrogen all the time. I don't know when it would last be lined, etc. We bought it in February, we put some sheep on it. We took the sheep off, we lambed them elsewhere. We let the twins have a bit of grazing on that and some cattle, but a lot of it was shut off, and we thought, if it's not got a lot of stock on it, it will just grow. But it hasn't.
no.
Overseeded 50 acres of it, which hasn't ever responded. Phosphate and potash is okay. The lime is slightly done. The reason for coming to these things is to look at your slide and say, you've got this amount of grass. How do I get there?
Well, it sounds like your nutrient cycle's stopped or is broken. So, as somebody said, your grass has to learn to start being fed from below rather than being fed from above. And if that cycle breaks, you're not going to get the grass growth. I think the other thing I'd say is species do matter. So if you wanted to do this system with sheep, I think personally, but some people disagree, but personally I think you need the right species of grass and herbs in there. And I think with this system, without those deep-rooted grasses and herbs, it's really hard to kick-start that, or you've got a long wait. And if the species isn't there and it's not in the next door field, where's it going to come from?
Let's take the sheep out of the equation. Let's just grow the grass.
Yeah, same principle. You're still going to need to kick-start that. And I find those deep-rooted grasses, if they're absent, then and if that field's been cultivated in the past, or if it's been sprayed out in the past, then you might not have the seed bank there. And I think it's a fine line between waiting 4 or 5 years on an unprotected field and actually just seeding it down to that diverse mixture, and then just starting, this is year 0 and this is where we're going through with this diverse mixture. The other thing I would say is you can do the bale grazing or the bale unrolling as well, that'll help, but just be aware you're going to lose productivity in the following year to when you unroll the bale. The year after that, your productivity on that section will go through the roof. But that's a good way of adding organic matter in and starting that process. There has to be an input to start that.
So, probably the fact that I didn't give it any nitrogen, it's a withdrawal stage.
Yeah, and if there's no clover there, I mean, sometimes if there's clover there, then it can take a bit of time once the nitrogen, if you put nitrogen on fields with clover in, then the clover doesn't do anything. So I'd have to see it to say, but I say if you haven't got the species there, then you probably need them.
The original farm that we had, there's loads of clover. Whenever I walked through the new 100 acres, there was none.
There you go.
So I made sure that there was clover in the 50 acres that I overseeded. I started to see some of it now, but it was a long process to get it done.
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing is to make sure that it's being grazed in the right way. So you can have over rest. So sometimes it's better to go in and graze it and then remove the stock so you've got that rest period, because that does promote the growth of the grass as well, and that'll start that process too. And in fact, a little bit of compaction will actually oxidise some of the nutrients in the soil and make that plant available, and so that can help too.
Can we go to Tony's question, and then I've got one other thing I wanted to do before lunch.
I was just wondering what your overall stocking rate over your whole farm is, sort of cows per hectare.
Yeah, so I'll answer that in a couple of different ways. We've just taken on more land last year, and we're building up through breeding up, so we're understocked at the moment. But in terms of when we've been wintering stock out with no hay, we can do, we run that at quite a low stocking rate of about 4 acres to a cow. Through all the year. And then once we are, but that's wintering everything out, so you've got significant cost reduction. Now, when you fix costs then go over your cows, obviously less cows is more fixed costs, we were discussing earlier. Rent, as someone who's renting, you know, the less cows I have, my rent per cow goes up. And so bearing all that in mind is why we've been looking at the bale grazing. Firstly, with the extensive bale grazing, where in a 10-acre field we might have 30 bales, to then having 200 bales in 5 acres, you know, and that varying route. And that, so far, we've looked, last winter I managed, basically my winter stocking rate is my limiting factor. And so last year we did about 2 acres to a cow through the whole winter with the bale grazing. So that's buying in the bales, but I think we could do it with making our own hay. And certainly from the regrowth we've got on some of the hay we made on our own land here, which I showed the picture of, I think that's not a problem. And when we start feeding the bales on there, which we won't do for a few years because it was arable last year. But yes, so a cow per hectare, I'd say we do better than that. And my aim is if I can get to about 1.6 acres per cow, which is in the top third for beef farmers in the UK. And if I can be at that stocking rate, it may not be sustainable. 1.6 acres per cow, which is that's sort of what the top third producers are doing in the UK in terms of stocking rate. But
use nitrogen fertiliser,
they are, and so and obviously got a lot of the cost reductions. So if I can do that, and the reason for me wanting to do that is because the stocking rate's the question that always gets asked, and that's the one that we've got to answer that question. And if we can, then this system's a no-brainer, and I think that's important. But yeah, I think that's what the potential is. I may pull back from there back to about 1.8 or 2, depending on the impacts of that stocking rate. But we'll see.
That including young stock?
That would include young stock, yeah. So just, you know, I was using that as a livestock unit then.